Hello everyone. Welcome to the stream. This is the Mostly Harmless Obelisk. Today we will be reading some classic horror by the author HP Lovecraft. Welcome in summertime. Hello, and as I said in chat, welcome in Kauai. Thank you for always stopping by. Oh, summertime, did you sign up for the live, what is it? The going live notifications on the Discord? Did you get the actual ping for that? I just want to see as a test if it was working. Excellent, excellent. I hope everyone's night is going excellent. True, same for me. Seems like every day my list of channels I'm subscribed to goes up by a little bit. Becomes a little bit harder to sort through everything. Just one moment, I'm making some tea. Gotta get that out. All right. Let's move into the reading room. Don't want all of that highlighted. There we go. Well, I hope everyone is at least a little tired tonight, because I'd like to share with you these readings. Hopefully some of you can have your dreams a little bit influenced. I wanted to pick one particularly sort of fantasy style story by HP Lovecraft and one more fantastical sort of cosmic horror type story. The first one will be The Outsider. This is one of HP Lovecraft's earlier works, for when he switched over to doing his horror style. Before this, he did a lot of poetry and, well, frankly, terrible essays. They for sure have historic value, but if you can see in the pinned comments, they have many viewpoints that are frankly abhorrent, which I think a lot of people know nowadays. And, yes, well, anyways. The first story is The Outsider by H.P. Lovecraft. That night the Baron dreamt of many a woe, and all his warrior guests, with shade and form of witch and demon and large coffin worm, were long be-nightmared. Keats. Unhappy is he to whom the memories of childhood bring only fear and sadness. Wretched is he who looks back upon lonely hours in vast and dismal chambers, with brown hangings and maddening rows of antique books, or upon odd watches in twilight groves of grotesque, gigantic, and vine-encumbered trees that silently wave twisted branches far aloft. Such a lot the gods gave to me. The dazed, the disappointed, the barren, the broken, and yet I am strangely content, and cling desperately to those sear memories when my mind momentarily threatens to reach beyond to the other. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages, and having high ceilings where the eye could find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridor seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere, as of the piled-up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that I used sometimes to light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief. Nor was there any sun outdoors, since the terrible trees grew high and above the topmost accessible tower. There was only one black tower, which reached above the trees to the unknown outer sky, but that was partly ruined and could not be ascended, save by a well-nigh impossible climb up a sheer wall, stone by stone. Thank you. I looked a decent bit to find those noises in the background. I must have lived years in this place, but I cannot measure the time. Beings must have cared for my needs, yet I couldn't recall any person except myself, or anything alive but the noiseless rats and bats and spiders. I think that whoever nursed me must have been shockingly aged, since my first conception of a living person was that of something mockingly like myself, yet distorted, shriveled, and decayed like the castle. To me, there was nothing grotesque in the bones and skeletons that stowed some of the stone crypts deep down among the foundations. I fantastically associated these things with everyday events, and thought them more natural than the colored pictures of living beings which I found in the moldy books. From such books I learned all that I know. No teacher urged or guided me, and I do not recall hearing any human voice in all those years, not even my own. For although I had read of speech, I had never thought to try to speak aloud. My aspect was a matter equally unthought of, for there were no mirrors in the castle, and I merely regarded myself by instinct as akin to the youthful figures I saw drawn and painted in books. I felt conscious of youth because I remember so little. Outside, across the putrid moat and under the dark mute trees, I would often lie and dream for hours about what I read in the books, and would longingly picture myself amidst gay crowds in the sunny world beyond the endless forest. Once I tried to escape from the forest, but as I went further from the castle to the shade, from the castle, the shade grew denser and the air more filled with brooding fear, so that I ran frantically back lest I lose my way in the labyrinth of nighted silence. So through endless twilights I dreamed and waited, though I knew not what I waited for. Then, in the shadowy solitude, my longing for light grew so frantic that I could rest no more, and I lifted entreating hands to the single black ruined tower that reached above the forest into the unknown outer sky, and at last I resolved to scale that tower, fall though I might, since it were better to glimpse the sky and perish than to live without ever beholding day. In the dank twilight I climbed the worn and aged stone stair till I reached the level where they ceased, and thereafter clung precariously to small footholds leading upwards. Ghastly and terrible was the dead, stairless cylinder of rock, black, ruined, and deserted, and sinister, with startled bats whose wings made no noise. But more ghastly and terrible still was the slowness of my progress, for climb as I might, the darkness overhead grew no thinner, and a new chill, as of haunted and venerable mold, assailed me. I shivered as I wondered why I did not reach the light, and would have looked down had I dared. I fancied that one night had come suddenly upon me. I fancied that night had come suddenly upon me, and vainly groped with one free hand for a window embrasure, that I might peer out and above and try to judge the height I had attained. All at once, after an infinity of awesome, sightless crawling up that concave and desperate precipice, I felt my head touch a solid thing, and I knew I must have gained the roof, or at least some kind of floor. In the darkness, I raised my free hand and tested the barrier, finding it stone and immovable. Then came a deadly circuit of the tower, clinging to whatever holds the slimy wall could give, till finally my testing had found the stone barrier yielding, and I turned upward again, pushing a slab or door with my head as I used both hands in my fearful ascent. There was no light revealed above, and as my hands went higher, I knew that my climb was for the nonce-ended, since the slab was the trapdoor of an aperture leading to a level stone surface of greater circumference than the lower tower, no doubt the floor of some lofty and capricious observation chamber. I crawled through carefully and tried to prevent the heavy slab from falling back into place, but failed in the latter attempt. As I lay exhausted on the stone floor, I heard the eerie echoes of its fall, and hoped, when necessary, to pry it open again. One moment as I get a drink of water. Believing I was now at a prodigious height, far above the accursed branches of the wood, I dragged myself up from the floor and fumbled about for windows that I might look for the first time upon the sky and the moon and stars of which I have read. But on every hand I was disappointed, since all that I found were vast shelves of marble bearing odious oblong boxes of disturbing size. More and more I reflected and wondered what hoary secrets might abide in this high apartment, so many aeons cut off from the castle below. Then unexpectedly, my hands came upon a doorway. There hung a portal of stone, rough with strange chiseling. Trying it, I found it locked, but with a supreme burst of strength, I overcame all obstacles and dragged it open inward, and as I did so, there came to me a purest ecstasy I have ever known, the shining tranquility through an ornate grating of iron and down a short stone passageway of steps that ascended from the newly found doorway was the radiant full moon, which I had never before seen save in dreams and vague visions I dared not call memories. Fancying now that I had attained the very pinnacle of the castle, I commenced to rush up the few steps beyond the door, but the sudden veiling of the moon by a cloud caused me to stumble, and I felt my way more slowly in the dark. It was still very dark when I reached the grating, which I tried carefully and found unlocked, but which I did not open for fear of falling from the amazing height to which I had climbed. Then the moon came out. Most demoniacal of all shocks is that of the abysmally unexpected and grotesquely unbelievable. Nothing I had before undergone could compare with the terror with what I now saw, with the bizarre marvels that sight implied. The sight itself was as simple as it was stupefying, for it was merely this. Instead of a dizzying prospect of treetops, seen from a lofty eminence, there stretched around me on a level through the grating nothing less than the solid ground, decked and diversified with marble slabs and columns, and overshadowed by an ancient stone church whose ruined spire gleamed spectrally in the moonlight. Half unconscious, I opened the grating and staggered out upon the white gravel path that stretched away in two directions. My mind, stunned and chaotic as it was, still held the frantic craving for light, and not even this fantastic wonder which had happened could stay my course. I neither knew nor cared whether my experience was insanity, dreaming, or magic, but was determined to gaze on brilliance and gaiety at any cost. I knew not who I was or what I was, or what my surroundings might be, though as I continued to stumble along, I became conscious of a kind of fearsome, latent memory that made my progress not wholly fortuitous. I passed under an arch out of that region of slabs and columns and wandered through the open country, sometimes following the visible road, and sometimes leaving it curiously to tread across meadows where only occasional ruins bespoke the ancient presence of a forgotten road. Once I swam across a swift river where crumbling, mossy masonry told of a bridge long vanished. Over 2 hours must have passed before I reached what seemed to be my goal, a venerable, ivied castle in a thick wooded park maddeningly familiar, yet full of perplexing strangeness to me. I saw that the moat was filled in, and that some of the well-known towers were demolished, whilst new wings extended to confuse the beholder. But what I observed with chief interest and delight were the open windows, gorgeously ablaze with light and sending forth sound of the gayest revelry. Advancing to one of these, I looked in and saw an oddly dressed company, indeed making merry, and speaking brightly to one another. I had never, seemingly, heard human speech before, and could guess only vaguely at what was said. Some of the faces seemed to hold expressions that brought an incredibly remote recollection. Others were utterly alien. I now stepped through the low window into the brightly lighted room. Stepped as I did, so from my single bright moment of hope into my blackest convulsion of despair and realization. The nightmare was quick to come, for as I entered the nightmare was quick to come, for as I entered, there occurred immediately one of the most terrifying demonstrations I had ever conceived. Scarcely had I crossed the still, when there descended upon the whole company a sudden and unheralded fear of hideous intensity, distorting every face and invoking the most horrible screams from nearly every throat. Flight was universal, and in the clamor and panic several fell in a swoon and were dragged away by their madly fleeing companions. Many covered their eyes with their hands and plunged blindly and awkwardly in their race to escape, overturning furniture and stumbling against the walls before they managed to reach one of the many doors. The cries were shocking, and as I stood in the brilliant apartment alone and dazed, listening to their vanishing echoes, I trembled at the thought of what might be lurking near me unseen. At a casual inspection, the room seemed deserted, but when I moved towards one of the alcoves, I thought I detected a presence there, a hint of motion beyond the golden arched doorway leading to another and somewhat similar room. As I approached the arch, I began to perceive the presence more clearly, and then, with the first and last sound I ever uttered, a ghastly ululation that revolted me almost as poignantly as its noxious cause, I beheld in full, frightful vividness the inconceivable, indescribable, and unmentionable monstrosity which had, by its simple appearance, changed a merry company to a herd of delirious fugitives. I cannot even hint what it was like, for it was a compound of all that is unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable. It was the ghoulish shade of decay, antiquity, and desolation, the putrid, dripping eidolon of unwholesome revelation, the awful bearing of that which the merciful earth should always hide. God knows what it was. It was not of this world, or no longer of this world. Yet to my horror, I saw in its eaten away and bone-revealed outlines a leering, abhorrent travesty on the human shape, and in its moldy, disintegrating apparel an unspeakably an unspeakable quality that chilled me even more. I was almost paralyzed, but not too much so to make a feeble effort towards flight. A backward stumble which failed to break the spell in which the nameless, voiceless monster held me. My eyes bewitched by the glassy orbs which stared lonesomely into them, refused to close, though they were mercifully blurred, and shewed the terrible object but indistinctly after the first shock. I tried to raise my hand to shut out the sight, yet so stunned were my nerves that my arm could not fully obey my will. The attempt, however, was enough to disturb my balance, so that I had to stagger forward several steps to avoid falling. As I did so, I became suddenly and agonizingly aware of the nearness of the carrion thing, whose hideous, hollow breathing I half fancied I could hear. Nearly mad, I found myself able to throw out a hand to ward off the voted apparition, which passed so close, when in one cataclysmic second of cosmic nightmarishness and hellish accident, my fingers touched the rotting, outstretched paw of the monster beneath the golden arch. I did not shriek, but all the fiendish ghouls that ride the night wind shrieked for me, as in that same second there crashed down upon my mind a single and fleeting avalanche of soul-annihilating memory. I knew, in that second, all that had been. I remembered beyond the frightful castle and the trees, and recognized the altered edifice in which I now stood. I recognized the most terrible of all, the unholy abomination that stood leering before me as I withdrew my sullied fingers from its own. But in the cosmos, there is balm, as well as bitterness, and that balm is Nephthene. In the supreme horror of that second, I forgot what had horrified me, and the burst of black memory vanished in a chaos of echoing images. In a dream, I fled from that haunted and accursed pile, and ran swiftly and silently in the moonlight. When I returned to the churchyard place of marble, and went down the steps, I found the stone trap door immovable, but I was not sorry, for I had hated that antique castle in the trees. Now I ride with the mocking and friendly ghouls on the night wind, and play by day amongst the catacombs of Nephron-Ka in the sealed and unknown valley of Hadath by the Nile. I know that light is not for me, save that of the moon over the rock tombs of Neb, nor any gaiety save the unnamed feast of Nichthcross beneath the Great Pyramid. Yet, in my new wildness and freedom, I almost welcomed the bitterness of alienage, for although Nephthene had calmed me, I know always that I am an outsider, a stranger in this century, and amongst those who are still men. This I have known ever since I stretched out my fingers to the abomination within the great gilded frame, stretched out my fingers and touched a cold and unyielding surface of polished glass. This has been The Outsider by HP Lovecraft. Ooh. I finished that faster than I expected I might. This reminds me a lot of the original Frankenstein. Absolutely. Actually, let me check. When was Frankenstein written? 1818. Yes, I believe, yeah, that predates HP Lovecraft. Yes, doesn't predate some of the Poe work that I went over last week, but this was written in, I believe, 1918, so almost 100 years after Frankenstein. I should definitely do Frankenstein at some point. I've been thinking I'd do a different author each week until I cover at least most of the classics. Yes, that is a long one though, you're right. Very long. Yeah, I never had to read it kawaii for school, but I know a lot of people must have. Sorry that right before I started talking about this book, I got a little, dour thinking about, you know, the whole topic about HP Lovecraft and what sort of person he was. It's not something that I necessarily had to bring up going over this story, The Outsider, but the next story, I think it definitely bears specific mentioning. In this and some stories, you know, topics about like race, disability, things which in general people back then were pretty terrible about, but H.P. Lovecraft was specifically terrible about. You know, they do come up in some of his works. The next one, it will come up. There's a lot of ways that people do think about it. I kind of go about it this way. I acknowledge that H.P. Lovecraft is a bad person, especially who he was when he was writing. Some of his correspondence suggests that maybe later in life he became a less terrible person, but still not great. And I think that in accepting that fact, I can at least look to his work and pick out the parts about his work that are good and the parts that are bad. I think that that's a pretty healthy way to look at it, but I absolutely understand that other people have different opinions about that sort of thing, and that many of those people are probably also correct in their way of thinking. There was a TV show that I think was on Netflix called Lovecraft Country, which partly went over that. The main character was a black man living in, I think it was the 50s or 60s, and he was himself a fan of the horror works of H.P. Lovecraft, while also being very critical of his other ideas. And even in that show, there were other people who criticized him for thinking those things. I think it's an open discussion to have, but not one that I particularly want to get into much more detail here. Kawaii says, thought that was Showmax or something else. Very possible. It might have been HBO. Is Showmax HBO? I know they went through several name changes. Well, anyways, I'm going to go take the tea bag out of that teapot and get myself a cup. I'll be right back. Alright, and we're back. So yeah, a bit of further detail about The Outsider. One of the reasons that I chose to pick this as the first HP Lovecraft story that I chose to read is because there was a service called LibriVox. Many years ago I went there, and they have audio readings of many old books. And Outsider was actually the very first HP Lovecraft content that I ever consumed, was from one of those audio readings. So it always held a somewhat special place in my heart. Also, it, I feel, is perhaps one of the easier ways to get someone into HP Lovecraft because it's quite short and it has very little, how should I say, shared connection with other stories. You don't really need to know much about HP Lovecraft or his work, and it doesn't have some of, in his later works, he uses kind of his own language to explain things, in a sort of Shakespearean style. He invented many words which are honestly quite difficult to read, and I'm not looking forward to having to learn how to pronounce all of them. He really dug deep into obscure Greek and Latin words to sort of invent new ways to describe things. So I think this is a very good intro for people. Let's see. Kawaii says, yeah, there were a lot of words that looked like Egyptian mythology in the last one. Yeah. Yes, those are all in the very end, though. Except Nephthene, which is part of Greek mythology. It was an elixir which could heal the mind. And Nephthene, at the time in the early 1900s, was kind of used to describe things like laudanum or other drugs that people took for, well, we would call mental illness. Laudanum, of course, was basically just opium and alcohol mixed together. And it was I'm pretty sure it was quite commonly prescribed at pharmacies back then for people who just had any sort of worry or mental pain. Sure wish I could just go to the pharmacy and ask for hard drugs. That's just a joke. Please don't ban me, John Twitch. Alright. This is Beyond the Wall of Sleep. I have an exposition of sleep come upon me. Shakespeare. I have frequently wondered if the majority of mankind ever pauses to reflect upon the occasionally titanic significance of dreams and of the obscure world to which they belong, whilst the greater number of our nocturnal visions are perhaps no more than faint and fantastic reflections of our waking experiences. Freud, to the contrary, with his puerile symbolism, there are still certain remainder whose mundane and ethereal character permits of no ordinary interpretation, and whose vague, exciting, and disquieting effect suggests possible minute glimpses into a sphere of mental existence no less important than physical life, yet separate from that life by an all but impassable barrier. From my experience, I cannot doubt but that man, when lost to terrestrial consciousness, is indeed sojourning in another, an uncorporeal life of far different nature from the life we know, and of which only the slightest and most indistinct memories linger after waking. From those blurred and fragmentary memories, we may infer much, yet prove little. We may guess that in dreams, life, matter, and vitality, as the earth knows such things, are not necessarily constant, and that time and space do not exist as our waking selves comprehend them. Sometimes I believe that this less material life is our truer life, and that our vain presence on the terrestrial globe is itself the secondary or merely virtual phenomenon. It was from a youthful reverie filled with speculations of this sort that I arose one afternoon in the winter of 1901, when to the state psychopathic institution I was served as an internee, was brought the man whose case has ever since haunted me so unceasingly. His name, as given on the record, was Joe Slater, or Slater, and his appearance was that of the typical denizen of the Catskill Mountain region, one whose strange, repellent scions of a primitive colonial peasant stock whose isolation for nearly 3 centuries in that hilly fastness of a little-traveled countryside has caused them to sink to a kind of barbaric degeneracy, rather than advance with their more fortunately placed brethren of the thickly settled districts. Among these odd folk who corresponded exactly with the descendant element of white trash in the South, laws and morals are non-existent, and their general mental status is probably below that of other sections of the Native American people. Joe Slater, who came to the institution in the diligent custody of 4 state policemen, and who was described as highly dangerous character, certainly presented no evidence of his perilous disposition when I first beheld him. Yeah, Kauai. Definitely, this man was real trash. HP Lovecraft. And I do intend to generally read everything that I read on this channel as it is written, with, I believe, 3 exceptions. All of them are HP Lovecrafts, which I will be censoring out, let's say, a certain word that he uses a few times. Through well above the middle stature and of somewhat brawny though well above the middle stature and of somewhat brawny frame, he was given an absurd appearance of harmless stupidity by the pale, sleepy blueness of his small, watery eyes, and scantness of his neglected and never-shaven growth of yellow beard, and his listless drooping of his heavy nether lip. His age was unknown, since among his kind neither family records nor permanent family ties exist, but from the baldness of his head in front, and from the decayed condition of his teeth, the head surgeon wrote them down as the head surgeon wrote him down as a man of about 40. From the medical and court documents, we learned all that could be gathered about his case. This man, a vagabond, hunter, and trapper, had always been strange in the eyes of his primitive associates. He had habitually slept at night, beyond the ordinary time, and upon waking would often talk of unknown things in a manner so bizarre as to inspire fear even in the hearts of an unimaginative populace. Not that his form of language was at all unusual, for he never spoke save in the debased patois of his environment, but the tone and tenor of his utterances were of such mysterious wildness that none might listen without apprehension. He himself was generally as terrified and baffled as his auditors, and within an hour after awakening would forget all that he had said, or at least all that had caused him to say what he did, relapsing into a bovine, half-amiable normality that, like that of the other hill dwellers. As Slater grew older, it appeared his mental aberrations had gradually increased in frequency and violence, till about a month before his arrival at the institution had occurred the shocking tragedy which caused his arrest by the authorities. One day near noon, after a profound sleep begun in a whiskey debauch at about 5 of the previous afternoon, the man had roused himself most suddenly with undulations so horrible and unearthly that they brought several neighbors to his cabin, a filthy sty where he dwelt with a family so as indescribable as himself. Rushing out into the snow, he had flung his arms aloft and commenced a series of leaps directly upward in the air. The while shouting his determination to reach some big cavern with brightness in the roof and walls and floor, and the loud, queer music far away. As 2 men of moderate size sought to restrain him, he had struggled with maniacal force and fury, screaming his desire and need to find and kill a certain thing that shines and shakes and laughs. At length, after temporarily felling one of his detainers with a sudden blow, he had flung himself upon the other with demoniac ecstasy of bloodthirstiness, shrieking fiendishly that he would jump high in the air and burn his way through anything that stopped him. Family and neighbors had now fled in a panic, and when the more courageous of them returned, Slater was gone, leaving behind an unrecognizable pulp-like thing that had been a living man but an hour before. None of the mountaineers had dared to pursue him, and it is likely that they would have welcomed his death from the cold. But when, several mornings later, they heard his screams in a distant ravine, they realized that he had somehow managed to survive, and that his removal in one way or another would be necessary. Then had followed an armed searching party whose purpose, whatever it may have been originally, became that of a sheriff's posse, after one of the seldom popular state troopers had by accident observed, then questioned and finally joined the seekers. On the 3rd day, Slater was found unconscious in the hollow of a tree and taken to the nearest jail, where alienists from Albany examined him as soon as his senses returned. To them he told a simple story. He had, he said, gone to sleep one afternoon, about sundown, after drinking too much liquor. He had awakened to find himself standing bloody-handed in the snow before his cabin, the mangled corpse of his neighbor, Peter Slater, at his feet. Horrified, he had taken to the woods in some vague effort to escape from the scene of what must have been his crime. Beyond these things, he seemed to know nothing, nor could the expert questioning of the interrogators bring out a single additional fact. That night, Slater slept quietly, and the next morning he wakened with no singular feature save a certain alteration of expression. One sec while I get a drink. Dr. Bernard, who had been watching the patient, though thought he noticed in the pale blue eyes a certain gleam of peculiar quality, and in the flaccid lips an all but imperceptible tightening, as if of intelligent determination. But when questioned, Slater relapsed into his habitual vacancy of the mountaineer, and only reiterated what he had said on the preceding day. On the third morning occurred the first of the man's mental attacks. After some show of uneasiness and sleep, he burst forth into a frenzy so powerful that the combined efforts of 4 men were needed to bind him in a straitjacket. The alienists listened with keen attention to his words, since their curiosity had been aroused to a high pitch by the suggestive, yet mostly conflicting and incoherent stories of his family and neighbors. Slater raved for upwards of 15 minutes, babbling in his backwoods dialect of great edifices of light, oceans of space, strange music, and shadowy mountains and valleys. But most of all, did he dwell upon some mysterious blazing entity that shook and laughed and mocked at him. This vast, vague personality seemed to have done him a terrible wrong, and to kill it in triumphant revenge was his paramount desire. In order to reach it, he said he would soar through the abyssness of emptiness, burning every obstacle that stood in his way. Thus ran his discourse, until with the greatest suddenness he ceased. The fire of madness died in his eyes, and in dull wonder he looked at his questioners and asked why he was bound. Dr. Bernard unbuckled the leathern harness and did not restore it till night, when he succeeded in persuading Slater to don it of his own volition, for his own good. The man had now admitted that he sometimes talked queerly, though he knew not why. Within a week, 2 more attacks appeared, but from them the doctors learned little. On the source of Slater's visions, they speculated at length, for since he could neither read nor write, and had apparently never heard a legend or fairy tale, his gorgeous imagery was quite inexplicable. That it could not come from any known myth or romance was made exceedingly clear by the fact that the unfortunate lunatic expressed himself only in his own simple manner. He raved of things he did not understand and could not interpret, things which he claimed to have experienced, but could not have learned through any normal or connected narration. Alienists soon agreed that abnormal dreams were the foundation of the trouble. Dreams whose vividness could, for a time, completely dominate the waking mind of this basically inferior man. With due formality, Slater was tried for murder, acquitted on the ground of insanity, and committed to the institution wherein I held so humble a post. Kawaii says, he raved of things he did not understand. What do you think about that, Kawaii? Just getting a drink. Kawaii says, well, that just sounds like what the author is doing. I'll discuss something that I think I have figured out about what the author thought of, well, many things at the end, but mental health in general. I have said that I am a constant spectator concerning dream life, and from this you may judge of the eagerness with which I applied myself to the study of the new patient, as soon as I had fully ascertained the facts of the case. He seemed to sense a certain friendliness in me, born no doubt of the interest I could not conceal, and the gentle manner in which I had questioned him. Not that he had ever recognized me during his attacks, when I hung breathlessly upon the chaotic but cosmic word pictures, but he had known me from his quiet hours, when he would sit by his barred window, weaving baskets of straw and willow, and perhaps pining for the mountain freedoms which he could never enjoy again. His family never called to see him. Probably it had found another temporary head after the matter of decadent mountain folk. By degrees I commenced to feel an overwhelming wonder at the mad and fantastic conceptions of Joe Slater. The man himself was pitiably inferior in mentality and language alike, but his glowing, titanic visions, though described in a barbarous and disjointed jargon, were assuredly things which only a superior, or even exceptionally brained individual could conceive. How, I often asked myself, could the stolid imagination of a Catskill degenerate conjure up such sights, whose very possession argued a lurking spark of genius? How could any backwoods dullard have gained so much as an idea of these glittering realms of supernatural radiance in space about which Slater ranted in his furious delirium? More and more I inclined to the belief that the pitiful personality who cringed before me lay with the disordered nucleus of something beyond my comprehension, something infinitely beyond the comprehension of my more experienced but less imaginative medical and scientific colleagues. And yet I could extract nothing definite from the man. The sum of all of my investigation was that, in a kind of semi-incorporeal dream life, Slater wandered or floated through resplendent and prodigious valleys, meadows, gardens, cities, and palaces of light, in a region unbounded and unknown to man, that there he was no peasant or degenerate, but a creature of importance and vivid life, moving proudly and dominantly, and checked only by a certain deadly enemy who seemed to be a being of visible yet ethereal structure, and who did not appear to be of human shape, since Slater never referred to it as a man or as aught save thing. Hello, Only Table. Welcome in. Tonight we are reading HP Lovecraft, and right now we are reading Beyond the Walls of Sleep. Earlier we were reading The Outsider. How are you doing tonight? Doing good, had a good week. That's great to hear. Well, welcome in. We are about halfway through the story. To sum it up in the very crude language of, well, in the very terrible language of HP Lovecraft, this has been taking place from the perspective of an intern at a mental institution, where a man has been interred after having committed murder but having no memory of it, and he has strange fantastical visions in his dreams. Let's see here. I have read to where? This thing had done Slater some hideous but unnamed wrong, which the maniac, if maniac he were, yearned to avenge. From the manner in which Slater alluded to their dealings, I judged that he and the luminous thing met on equal terms. That, in his dream existence, the man was himself a luminous thing of the same race as his enemy. This impression was sustained by his frequent references to flying through space and burning all that impeded his progress. Yet these conceptions were formulated in rustic words wholly inadequate to convey them, a circumstance which drove me to the conclusion that if a true dream world indeed existed, oral language was not its medium for the transmission of thought. Could it be that the dream soul inhabiting this inferior body was desperately struggling to speak things which the simple and halting tongue of dullness could not utter? Could it be that I was face to face with intellectual emanations which would explain the mystery if I could but learn to discover and read them? I did not tell the older physicians of these things, for middle age is skeptical, cynical, and disinclined to accept new ideas. Besides, the head of the institution had but lately warned me, in his paternal way, that I was overworking, that my mind needed rest. It had long been my belief that human thought consists basically of atomic or molecular motion, convertible to ether waves of radiant energy like heat, light, and electricity. This belief had early led me to contemplate the possibility of telepathy or mental communication by means of suitable apparatuses, and I had in my college days prepared a set of transmitting and receiving instruments somewhat similar to the cumbrous devices employed in wireless telegraphy at that crude pre-radio period. These I had tested with a fellow student, but achieving no results, had soon packed them away with other scientific odds and ends for possible future use. Now, in my intense desire to probe into the dream life of Joe Slater, I sought these instruments again, and spent several days in repairing them for action. When they were complete once more, I missed no opportunity for their trial. At each outburst of Slater's violence, I would fit the transmitter to his forehead and the receiver to my own, constantly making delicate adjustments for various hypothetical wavelengths of intellectual energy. I had but little notion of how these thought impressions would, if successfully conveyed, arouse an intelligent response in my brain. But I felt certain that I could detect and interpret them. Accordingly, I continued my experiments, though informing no one of their nature. It was on the 21st of February, 1901, that the thing finally occurred. As I looked back across the years, I realized how unreal it seems, and sometimes half wonder if old Dr. Fenton was not right when he had charged it all to my excited imagination. I recall he listened with great kindness and patience when I told him, but afterwards gave me a nerve powder and arranged for the half-year's vacation, on which I departed the next week. That fateful night, I was widely agitated and perturbed, for despite the excellent care he had received, Joe Slater was unmistakably dying. Perhaps it was his mountain freedom that he missed, or perhaps the turmoil in his brain had grown too acute for his rather sluggish physique. But at all events, the flame of vitality flickered low in his decadent body. He was drowsy near the end, and as darkness fell, he dropped off into a troubled sleep. I did not strap on the straitjacket as was customary when he slept, since I saw that he was too feeble to be dangerous, even if he woke in mental disorder once more before passing away. But I did place upon his head and mine the two ends of the cosmic radio, hoping against hope for a first and last message from the dream world in the brief time remaining. Sorry, is my PNG tuber not moving anymore? I am just checking something out. Yes, it crashed. One moment while I reload this. Okay, I was able to get it loaded quickly. There we go. Sorry about that, Yeah. That's all it was. Everything's working fine. It took me to a random part of the story. Let's see here. I did place upon his head and mine two ends of the cosmic radio. Oh, let's see here. Only table says, You just noticed that too. Is there an official art ref for the etchings on the obelisk? You know what? I don't think there is. That is something that I think I could throw that together a bit later tonight, or maybe Kawaii, who is my official artist, could put it together. I should have that up on card soon, and also on the Discord. Let me put the link for that in the chat. Let's see. Only Table says I had an idea for some mostly harmless RimWorld fan art that you want to take a crack at. I have only played RimWorld a little bit. It is something that I had some interest in because I liked Dwarf Fortress, which it's based on. But I just never took the time to learn how to play RimWorld. But it does look interesting. Let's see. I did place upon his head and mine the two ends of the cosmic radio, hoping against hope for a first and last message from the dream world in the brief time remaining. In the cell with us was one nurse, a mediocre fellow who did not understand the purpose of the apparatus, or think to inquire into my course. As the hours wore on, I saw his head droop awkwardly in sleep, but I did not disturb him. I myself lulled by a rhythmic breathing of the healthy and dying man, I must have nodded a little later. There we go. Only Table says RimWorld has an anomaly DLC, which has obelisks that pose a threat to colonists. That is extremely fitting. The sounds of weird, lyric music was what aroused me. Chords, vibrations, and harmonic ecstasies echoed passionately on every hand. Well, on my ravished sight burst the stupendous spectacle of ultimate beauty. Walls, columns, and architraves of living fire blazed effulgently around the spot where I seemed to float in air, extending upwards to an infinitely high vaulted dome of indescribable splendor, blending with this display of palatial magnificence, or rather, supplanting it at times in kaleidoscopic rotations where glimpses of wild plains and graceful valleys, high mountains and inviting grottos, covered with every lovely attribute of scenery which my delighted eye could conceive of, yet formed wholly of some glowing, ethereal, plastic entity which in consistency partook as much of spirit as matter. As I gazed, I perceived that my own brain held the key to these etchings of these enchanting metamorphoses, for each vista which appeared to me was the one my changing mind most wanted to behold. Amid this Elysian realm, I dwelt not as a stranger, for each sight and sound was familiar to me, just as it had been for uncounted aeons of eternity before, and would be for like eternities to come. Then the resplendent aura of my brother of light drew near and held colloquy with me, soul to soul, with silent and perfect interchange of thought. The hour was one of approaching triumph, for was not my fellow being escaping at last from a degraded, periodic bondage, escaping forever, and preparing to follow the accursed oppressor, even unto the innermost fields of ether, that upon it might be wrought a flaming cosmic vengeance, which would shake the spheres, which we floated thus for a little time, when I perceived a slight blurring and fading of the objects around us, as though some force were recalling me to earth. Where I least wished to go. The form near me seemed to feel a change also, for it gradually brought its discourse to a conclusion, and itself prepared to quit the scene, fading from my sight at a rate somewhat less rapid than the other objects. A few more thoughts were exchanged, and I knew that the luminous one and I were being recalled to bondage, though for my brother of light it would be the last time. The sorry planet shell being well nigh spent. In less than an hour my fellow would be free to pursue the oppressor along the Milky Way and pass the hither stars to the vast confines of infinity. A well-defined shock separates my final impression of the fading scene of light from my sudden and somewhat shame-faced awakening, and straightening up in my chair as I saw the dying figure on the couch move hesitantly. Joe Slater was indeed awakening, though probably for the last time. As I looked more closely, I saw that in the shallow cheeks shone spots of color which had never been present. The lips, too, seemed unusual, being tightly compressed, as if by the force of a stronger character than had been Slater's. The whole face finally began to grow tense, and the head turned restlessly with closed eyes. I did not arouse the sleeping nurse, but readjusted the slightly disarranged headbands of my telepathic radio, intent to catch any parting message the dreamer might have to deliver. Let's see. Kawaii says, just looked it up. There appear to be many obelisks in Rimworld, twisted, corrupted, and warped. My favorite because it looks like a crab claw. Okay, I gotta look that up later. All at once, the head turned sharply in my direction, and the eyes fell open, causing me to stare in blank amazement at what I beheld. The man who had been Joe Slater, the Catskill descendant, was now gazing at me with a pair of luminous, expanded eyes, whose blue seemed subtly to have deepened. Neither mania nor degeneracy was visible in that gaze, and I felt beyond a doubt that I was viewing the face beyond which lay an active mind of high order. At this juncture, my brain became aware of a steady, external influence operating upon it. I closed my eyes to concentrate my thoughts more profoundly, and was rewarded by the positive knowledge that my long-sought mental message had come at last. Each transmitted idea formed rapidly in my mind, and though no actual language was employed, my habitual associations of conception and expression was so great that I seemed to be receiving the message in ordinary English. Joe Slater is dead, came the soul-petrifying voice or agency from beyond the wall of sleep. My opened eyes sought the couch of pain and curious horror, but the blue eyes were still calmly gazing, and the countenance was still intelligently animated. He is better dead, for he was unfit to bear the active intellect of the cosmic entity. His gross body could not undergo the needed adjustments between ethereal life and planet life. He was too much of an animal, too little a man, yet it is through his deficiency that you have come to discover me, for the cosmic and planet souls rightly should never meet. He has been my torment in diurnal prison for 42 of your terrestrial years. I am an entity like that which you yourself become in the freedom of dreamless sleep. I am your brother of light, and I have floated with you in the effulgent valleys. It is not permitted me to tell you, your waking earth self, of your real self. But we are all roamers of vast spaces, and travelers in many ages. Next year I may be dwelling in the dark Egypt which you call ancient, or in the cruel empire of Sunchan which is to come in 3,000 years hence. You and I have drifted to worlds that reel about red Arcturus, and dwelt in bodies of the insect philosophers that crawl proudly over the fourth moon of Jupiter. How little does the earth self know of life and its extent. How little, indeed, ought it to know for its own tranquility. Of the oppressor I cannot speak. You on earth have unwittingly felt its distant presence. You who, without knowing, idly give it its blinking beacon the name of Al Ghul, the Daemon Star. It is to meet and conquer the oppressor that I have vainly striven for aeon, held back by bodily encumbrances. Tonight I go as a nemesis, bearing just and blazingly cataclysmic vengeance. Watch me in the sky close by the demon star. I cannot speak longer, for the body of Joe Slater grows cold and rigid, and the coarse brains are ceasing to vibrate as I wish. You have been my friend in the cosmos. You have been my only friend on this planet, the only soul to sense and seek for me within the repellent form which lies on the couch. We shall meet again, perhaps in the shining mists of Orion's sword, perhaps on the bleak plateau in prehistoric Asia, perhaps in unremembered dreams tonight, perhaps in some other form an aeon hence, when the solar system shall have been swept away. At this point, the thought waves abruptly ceased, and the pale eyes of the dreamer, or shall I say dead man, commenced to blaze fishily. In a half-stupor, I crossed over to the couch and felt of his wrist, but found it cold, stiff, and pulseless. The sallow cheeks paled again, and the thick lips fell open, disclosing the repulsively rotten fangs of the degenerate Joe Slater. I shivered, pulled a blanket over the hideous face, and awakened the nurse. Then I left the cell and went silently to my room. I had an incessant and unaccountable craving for a sleep whose dreams I should not remember. The climax? What plain tale of science can boast of such a rhetorical effect? I have merely set down certain things appealing to me as facts, allowing you to construe them as you will. As I have already admitted, my superior, old Dr. Fenton, denies the reality of everything I have related. He vows that I was broken down with nervous strain and badly in need of a long vacation on full pay which he so generously gave me. He assures me, on his professional honor, that Joe Slater was but a low-grade paranoiac whose fantastic notions must have come from the crude hereditary folk tales which circulate in even the most decadent of communities. All this he tells me, yet I cannot forget what I saw in the sky on that night after Slater died. Lest you think me a biased witness, another's pen must add this final testimony, which may perhaps supply the climax you expect. I will quote the following account of the star Nova Perusi verbatim from the pages of the eminent astronomical authority, Professor Garrett P. Service. On February 22nd, 1901, a marvelous new star was discovered by Dr. Anderson of Edinburgh. Not very far from Algol, no star had been visible at this point before. Within 24 hours, the stranger had become so bright it outshone Capella. In a week or two, it had visibly faded, and in the course of a few months, it was hardly discernible with the naked eye. This has been Beyond the Wall of Sleep by HP Lovecraft. Whew. Need another drink. Kawhi says, I can see why you picked this. Yes, I rather love the conclusion here. And, although, sorry, I'm trying to figure out the best way to discuss these works. Neglecting to talk about the repellent parts of this work. There are many things in this that I rather love aside from just the climax. For one, to provide a little bit of backstory, the time period in which these writings are being made was during a sort of second scientific revolution. A large number of things were being learned in this period, including the, at the time, the idea of what the mind was vastly changing. And what would become neuroscience much later was being discovered. The device that he mentions using something similar to the telegraph signals from the brain, being analogous to what we know about the brain, that electrical signals are what cause thoughts, is something that I found very interesting that he had come up with at this time. Let's see here. Some other things that I found interesting looking them up. The use of the word alienist was, in the early 19th century, what people used to say, we call them psychiatrists now. The reason that they were called alienists then is because of the belief that mental illness causes people to be alienated from society. That, rather, people with mental illness are aliens compared to humans. Which, that's an idea that, well, first off, I understand why we don't use it anymore, because it's calling people with mental disorders, or in many cases, these aren't even mental disorders that people are being described as having, because it also meant gay people, or people with, say, developmental disorders, or even just people with quote-unquote hysteria, which meant basically women who didn't want to be controlled by men, among other things. It was saying that not only were they being effectively kept out of society, but that is natural to keep them out of society. I found it interesting to look into that. Only Table says, I'm sure others have mentioned, but I appreciate the historical context you provide to language and prose. Thank you. I'm trying my best. And of course, I would love for other people to comment on what they think about these stories, and also just what they think it means from the perspective of the author, anything like that. Let's see here. Some other things that I noticed in this. Oh, yes. Okay. So, obviously, there was a huge amount of racism, especially at the beginning. But throughout the work was a large amount of classism as well, which HP Lovecraft most certainly held for other Americans. He singles out people from the Catskill Mountains, which, if you're not aware, there were no cities. Actually, I don't think there are cities currently in the Catskills region, which is kind of around Kentucky, I believe. A mountain range that goes through Kentucky, maybe also Georgia. Anyways, at the time, among people in, the big metropolises like New York and Philadelphia, it was very common to have extremely negative opinions about the people living in those sorts of places. And to some extent today, we also have those, views of calling certain kinds of people white trash or various things, merely because they're poor or other such reasons. But back during the time of HP Lovecraft, it was also believed that these people were not just materially deficient and morally deficient, but also that there was something specifically wrong with their biology. If you've ever heard of... I'm trying to remember what the word is, because they had a specific word. It wasn't degeneracy, though. It was, Oh my, I wish I remembered. Anyways, there was a belief that certain people are born to be intelligent or not intelligent. This is where the term moron comes from, is one of those things. And it was believed that these people would be come about in communities, like whole communities would be communities of morons, and these people needed to be treated medically for this. And those medical treatments were usually things like castration or other ways to make them infertile so that there would be no more generations of morons. This is the basis of what the eugenics movement would come about to advocate for, and was a huge, widespread belief in America at the time. Something very scary. It affected a large number of communities very negatively, especially because they would target Black and Latin American communities with forced sterilization. Very scary stuff. Let's see. Kawaii says, yep, the label moron is related to the origin of IQ tests, which have a lot of problems. It was used to screen out immigrants for unfair reasons. That is one more thing it was used for, yes. Oh, something... This is something I know a little bit less of the history of in terms of science, but when he's talking about the brain, obviously he's incorrect to assume that it is some sort of molecular motion that causes brains to think. It's electrical signals. But he brings up atomics, and that reminds me of how Greek philosophers had no scientific basis for believing this, but there was a group, the atomists, who believed that basically in atomic theory, something kind of analogous to atomic theory. It's kind of reminding me how HP Lovecraft here is talking about brain signals in a way like the atomists, where he's kind of describing what is true far before it was actually discovered. Let's see. Not in this story, but in the last one, the outsider, especially when he's talking about the appearance of the monster in the mirror. He uses a lot of language that will be used a lot in his later works, where he describes something by saying it's indescribable. This is a technique which is kind of the cornerstone of what we know as Lovecraftian horror, or some people now call eldritch horror, because they want to, sort of take the genre further away from Lovecraft, especially since there have been countless authors who have, expanded on these ideas. It's the concept that there is nothing more scary to someone than something that they cannot, comprehend. If I tell you something is more scary than you can imagine, then that is instantly more scary than me saying it's a big furry monster. Kawaii says, they're referring to Only Table. Yes, the first story that we had gone over was The Outsider. Yeah, that's a good summary of it. Oh, Only Table, you're a fan of Motaberry. I think I have some of those emotes. Oh, my subscription ended. But yes, I also watch Motaberry. Well, I had a rather fun time reading these tales with you. Now, if you missed any of it, I will be posting this to my YouTube channel, and you can find my YouTube channel through my card, which you can see by scrolling down to my About Me, or you can join me on Discord. I will post the link here, Discord, and join our community. What a pleasant night. I hope these tales will inspire some nightmares for all of you when you go to sleep tonight. And let's see, I'm going to take a look at who I want to raid. Only Table says, sorry for joining late, thank you for stream. Absolutely no problem. It's a busy night for everyone. Friday night. Summertime says, great stream. It was nice to have you back while I played Yakuza. Which one are you playing? Yakuza Like a Dragon, trying to get all the achievements. Good luck with that. Okay, you know what? I see someone currently streaming in the reading and writing section, and they are reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I shall be raiding into them. I do not know this Twitch streamer, Fabulich, but let's do this. Raid Fabulich. Let's see. There we go. I've got the raid going now. Thank you for coming, everyone. And I wish you terrible nightmares.